Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is the 7th of these Paths to Utopia in Conversations evenings. My name's Neil Denny. Tonight we're talking about Discord, and I'm joined by Caitlin Shepherd and Luke Harney, aka Typeson, who are just two of the collaborators on this project. There's a number of people who will be talked about later on. Caitlin's going to introduce the project herself first of all, and then hand over to Luke to talk about his part in the project as well, and then we're going to have a conversation about it. So Caitlin, please go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, so Discord is definitely a collaborative project, and I am going to take a moment to talk about the different phases of collaboration that gave birth to this work. But it's a commission from King's Cultural Institute, and it's a product of original thinking between James Wood, who's a postdoctoral researcher into mortgage finance economics at King's, and myself and Victoria Johnson, who is head of marketing at Sound and Music. And if you don't know what Discord is, to try and describe it, it's a 30-minute experience that's part embodied and part sonic, and it's set up as a property viewing experience where you view three properties from across the social spectrum, the social class spectrum, and then you're invited to bid on which property you yourself would like to own. So that's the kind of summary, and conceptually the work seeks to examine what sort of homes people from different socioeconomic backgrounds can afford, and how your class identity determines what sort of security you can have in terms of accessing rented or owner-occupant housing. So it's a kind of exploration into the have and the have-nots of home and affordable housing. So that's an overview.
Okay, so Luke, do you want to say about how you got involved?
I met Caitlin, and there was rumblings of this project on the horizon, and we spoke in the early stages, and the thing came to pass, and she asked, and I gradually started to learn about this amazing vision that she had. And initially I was asked to come on board as a musician and composer, and actually found myself collaborating in a much wider way, which was really enjoyable.
So we've got some clips.
Yeah.
Shall we play?
Could I just, before we do, just quickly give a quick summary of the different collaborators involved, because that would be quite a useful thing, just so I've done like the housekeeping and listed everyone's role before we listen to a clip of the piece. So Luke Harney, also known as Typeson, was the lead composer, but also we worked very closely conceptually. But just to start from the beginning, there's phase one, which was James Wood, Victoria Johnson and myself securing the commission from King's Cultural Institute after an open space lab that was held in Somerset House in spring last year. And then we secured the initial commission, and we got funding from the Arts Council. So that was kind of team concept, and that was, we want to make a piece that explores access to housing and how kind of wage earnings, earnability, social and economic status affects what you can have in terms of housing security or not. And then we entered into the making and thinking about how to realise this very topical idea on paper and think, what do we want it to be? So because my PhD is really looking into sound studies and sort of the role of sound and listening cultures, it was going to be something sound related. And to do that, Luke and I started working really closely. Tabitha Pope, who's the lead architect, because if you go to the piece, or if you've been in the piece, it's a big set, and it needed to be conceptualised and designed and built. So that was Tabby's role. And then we worked with two other composers, Elise Plans and Matthias Kisbert, who were brought on through Sound and Music, calling out for two new composers to contribute to the musical soundscape, and that was great. And then we worked with a build crew who have we built non-stop from the 1st until the 23rd, and that was Dan Hallahan and Ben Desure Robinson, and they're set builders and engineers. And then we worked with lighting engineers, Bales and Light, and loads of friends, and I've covered everyone. I wanted to really go through that list because without an acknowledgement of the team and the skills, what Discord is in past Utopia would not be what it is, and I just think that's really important to acknowledge collaboration. So I've done my housekeeping and my dues, so that's the list.
Okay, well let's hear one of the clips. Do you want to describe what these clips are, Luke?
Yeah, we'll start with the corridor then? Yeah. So as you enter into the piece, as Caitlin was saying, you're given 3 keys and a brochure to view 3 properties and a bidding card, and the assistant greets you and says welcome, and you hear a short audio with a friendly estate agent voice who says, welcome, and please make your way through to your viewings. Upon opening the door, you're greeted by this piece. So, this piece.
You know what? What is a politician going to do about fixing the housing crisis in Britain? Nothing. Is the short term. So what you do is that if you can afford to buy a house, somehow, by hook or by crook, you'll do it. It's about getting on the ladder, it's about making the mortgage payments and just hoping that the thing keeps going up and up and up forever.
Please make your way to your second property. Check your viewing card for the address. Once you've found your door, let yourself in and see what you think. We hope you like it. Please make your way to your second viewing.
And then should we just go straight on to the second clip, and then we can talk about them both?
Yeah, sure. So what on top of that, there are some instructions telling you to move to your next property, and actually in the corridor itself, we paid quite a lot of attention to the quality of sound. So there's a lot of low end that we're not hearing in here, and it's quite immersive.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, it's very, it's a flavour of the concept to play this sound here, because it's an installation and an experience. It's quite difficult to listen to that outside of the context and the narrowness and the blackness and the task orientation that you're faced with as you're hearing that. So it's a very abstract exercise, and it's just, it's to kind of describe the narrative and the emotional tone, but it's really tricky to try and summarise the quality of an experience when it's presented as a whole environment, not just a broadcast. So I just want to, in defence of the immersion.
Well, let's play the second clip, which is a clip of one of the interviews, and we'll talk about the interviews later as well, as we'll come back and talk about the music as well. But let's just play the second clip, so we've got them both up the way.
You can say something about the interview and how that.
Yeah, so this is going to be an interview with who?
So by name, I keep the interviews anonymous for ethical reasons. But this is a woman in her late 40s. She has been a tenant of social housing her whole life. She's talking about the home where she was born and where her parents lived as social housing tenants, so on a reduced rental rate, normally about 20% off the going rental market rates is what translates to social housing. And she's talking about her home and what home means to her, and she's also talking about what she does in the home, and you'll hear some other things that she touches on. So she's one of 20 interviews I did, and then 3 made the kind of final edit to try and describe a cross-spectrum of class status. So that's the sort of conceptual purpose.
And there's one of these in each of the installations.
In each of the 3 rooms. So I think we're going to see the picture.
Yeah,
of
we'll have a look at the slides after we've heard the interview.
And so you walk in and you pick up headphones.
Yeah.
And so then you kind of there's a chair and you sit down and you listen to this.
I don't know, just being in the council, like being with the council, I don't know, do it give you false security? I don't know. It do mean a lot to me living in this house. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it just feels like probably the only place I have belonged to in my life. No, yeah, it means everything to me, really. Just nice to come home and feel at home. Well, it's a 3-bedroom house. We've always had it since we were born, all of us. And it's just trying to keep it going now my dad's gone. Our dad done all the gardening, really. My mum done all the flowers. Then my dad done all the vegetables and that out the back. There's another garden, yeah, at the back. And obviously we've got a greenhouse with tomatoes in. Got lettuces going and cabbages and taken that on quite well. It's my first year of doing it properly. Dug our first potatoes up yesterday. Yeah. Got a little shed where I go and have my fags, because there's obviously no smoking in the house and everything. A bit of me time. Just what the memories all year, over the amount of years and all what we've done in here as a family. I think it's probably the sweat and the money and everything that my mum and dad's put in it over the years of bringing me and my 5 brothers up in here as well. Like, do you know what I mean? And yeah, I just love this house. My mum and dad would have loved nothing better than over their lifetime is to afford to have bought this house. But it was never possible. Like, they had the 5 boys and then they had me bringing me up. They always worked. We never went without anything, but they could never afford to actually buy the house. Well, it just seems like they're how do you say it without being racist? It just seems like the immigrants are coming in, they're getting our house in. You know what I mean? And then you've got people here with I got nieces in the family that's got 2 children. Still living at home with their parents. And then you get like immigrants coming in and they get housed. It's just how quick they get in. And when we've got people like we're waiting for years and years, and it just seems like, oh well. Yeah, and then they say, oh, it's emergency move. It seems like people like they are taking our jobs, they are taking our house in. People like me can see no different in that happening. Charity begins at home, don't it? We should be looking after the people in this country before we're looking after other people. Like, you can't afford it. No, when you look in the paper and you look at these private houses, that's for sale, for rent, and nobody really can afford it. And if you could afford it, you'd have to go without everything else. You'd have to go without your food and a bit of warmth in the winter. My nephew and his partners, they had a rented place. They were in there for about 2-3 years. Hardly anything got really done by the landlord. And they had one accident and they got them out. She left a little stove ring on. It burnt the tea towel. It was a little bit of smoke damage and they had them straight out. You've got no security. There's no security for people.
Okay, so let's talk about the theme for a bit. So this is Paths to Utopia.
Yeah.
This is a vision of a discordant society. So how does that relate to the overall theme of Utopia?
Wow. This was something we thought about a lot in phase 1, the conceptual phase. And we were thinking, James and I in particular, were thinking a lot about pluralism and this idea that if we're trying to imagine an island that doesn't even really exist by kind of etymology and is a conceptual tool to think through where is a better society, and I'm talking about kind of Thomas More's original vision, and that we've really felt in early discussions that one person's vision of utopia is another person's oppression. If we're talking about singular visions of a better world, if we're talking about policy change, or we're talking about housing low-income families over immigrants, for example, as this interview might suggest is a problem in her life. So plurality and plurality of kind of ideas of improved society was really key to our first stage of thinking. And when we were thinking, how are we going to make a piece that advocates really, really multiple perspectives and tolerance and diversity on the topic of housing, we need to represent the experience of housing and home from a multitude of perspectives. And I guess in that instance, we were in a way playing quite conceptual devil's advocate with the original notion of utopia. But if you really think that, like, you know, it's actually a non-place in terms of its conceptual design, it doesn't really exist. It's a space to think through an alternative. Then it can be anything. And our utopia looks like a place where there's a lot more tolerance about how we think about equality, because really housing is a mirror for equality and access. So that's the kind of first link, is pluralism. And also the second link is creating a piece that doesn't allow us as researchers and artists to go, hey, this is our view of utopia. Like, this is what we want you to think about our better world, which in my mind is quite traditional campaigning. I used to be a professional campaigner. And I have some trouble with the didactic nature of, like, we got to fix this, and this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to get this politician to change this policy, and then it's going to be fine. And you're going to do it through a petition, and you're going to do it through some straightforward lobbying. But if you can make a piece that invokes you to reflect and think through, well, what are the different ways of getting to this more just world, and how would we do that? So they're the kind of first wave ideas that we thought through at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the title, I remember you saying quite early on that, you know, in some ways the ultimate utopia could be considered as the ultimate discord, if you were genuinely attempting to hear as many voices as possible.
Well remembered.
Well, I mean, that stuck with me.
No, totally. That was a big part of the thinking. Yeah.
And I was going to ask,
what would it's the labelling of that discord as being problematic is in the mind of the beholder. So
I was going to ask what
I
it
think
was.
That's the question mark. You know.
What it was that appealed to you about that idea. So when Caitlin approached you to take part,
I think primarily the idea that, because I know just from speaking to Caitlin straight away that, you know, that these ideas are foremost in her mind all of the time, to do with social justice and change and integrating art practice with political, you know, criticism of political strategy, etc. That there was an opportunity to bring my musical ideas more closely in with that world, which is a world I appreciate often from the outside, because that's although I'm not kind of in any way sort of straight and traditional in my musical approach, very often that there's not been an obvious way to explore ideas which aren't purely aesthetic or purely functional. So I, in talking with Caitlin and particularly and Tabitha, the first kind of stage of the process that I was involved in explicitly was 2 days with myself, Caitlin and Tabby, who's the architect, and I kind of sat and listened and asked questions because I had no idea what was going on, and just felt like this this mothership was landing, and I liked immediately the idea that there was something going to be created that was functional, political, aesthetic, and embodied. So, and I think going back to the initial introduction, that's a really key aspect as well that stood out for me about the whole work is, yes, there is a strong kind of conceptual narrative that can be taken away, although it's not, as Caitlin says, didactic. It's not, you should go away thinking this, but there's a really strong physicality to the work, and Caitlin spoke quite clearly that something that she wanted to express was, or that she wanted the participants to experience was the paradox of a very intimate experience where you're sat kind of in somebody's house listening to their world view in a way that you know maybe you never, you know, when would you ever get into a conversation that deep for that long with somebody about such a specific matter, and you're experiencing the house with the smells and the lighting, etc. And then you're out into this corridor of what she refers to as the corridor of oppression.
I mean, the corridor was always the corridor of oppression from the very beginning, really, wasn't it? It's interesting to think through the development of the materiality, but I just want to jump in and say that the really interesting aesthetic but also philosophical juxtaposition I think that I'm very interested in the work is the intimacy of the living room, and primarily presented to the audience as a property viewing. So you're voyeuristic in the concept. You're unlocking this door and you get in and there's a headset and there's an environment that describes a class identity, broadly set through taste-making exercises of thinking through what sort of class identity is expressed through object and aesthetic of the home. And Grace and Perry obviously was like walking around in our kind of research area. And I think the juxtaposition between the intimacy of the ethnography of home, which is how I've been referring to the interviews in my research, but also in thinking about all this content that, you know, going out into the world and interviewing loads of different people, set against the pitch black, very narrow corridor. And I just think the corridor of oppression is, in the experience, conceptually important because it's a metaphor as the disciplinary mechanisms of the mortgage finance sector. And therein I can tie in James Wood's research, where he's a doctoral researcher at King's and a key collaborator, and he looks into how the kind of financialisation of the individual through the trend in the UK of a lot of people entering into mortgage debt for the majority of their working life is actually a disciplinary mechanism on our behaviour. So it gives the worker negotiation in the labour market far less agency and choice. So when we link into the embodiment of this black corridor that surrounds the living rooms and the intimate stories of home, and like, how come I'm in these rooms hearing these people's stories from different backgrounds, with different jobs, with different identities, is that we're all linked into the corridor of oppression, which is the dominant economy that lets us earn a certain amount or not, or negotiate with our cultural and intellectual capital into the labour market or not, and, you know, predominantly pursue the security of housing through mortgage finance, which is contestable as the best way of doing things. So there's that kind of background, and I just wanted to link in James a little bit.
We'll come back to James's work a bit more a bit later on, and also before that I want you to walk through those slides and you can sort of visualise those rooms as you've been sort of describing the rooms. But before we do that, Caitlin, Luke's just mentioned, I just want to talk about your sort of wider work. Luke mentioned this idea that, you know, your key thing is taking your art practice out into politics. Tell me what that actually means to you.
Okay, so that all sounds very grand and big. Thanks. I feel like, it's like a long story, but I think that I've always been really interested in ideas of equality and justice broadly, and I've lived a bit of a double life between being a professional activist, working for Oxfam, setting up quite a successful food waste campaign, and then keeping a creative practice going that's always kind of orbited around oral histories. And I didn't realise, but now I'm doing my PhD and thinking about research methodology, I realised that I'm really an ethnographer and kind of really interested in cultural geography. So how my work looks at politics is more to do with taking time through my practice to listen to stories of the everyday. And I think in terms of, you know, reference theoretically, to ground this a bit, it's about art as social practice, which is a theory in an area of disciplinary practice. And to translate that into like normal chat, I'm really interested in the power structures of kind of dominant policies playing out at governmental level, and I'll stay within the UK at the moment, and how they shape the personal. So the personal is political, And we all go through that. We all go through that, whether it's like gender identity or kind of access to go through a meritocracy, or if we have access to decent education. We're all living these stories, but they all link into the structure of dominant political ideology. So I'm interested in making that link through my work. And how that happens, I think it happens through ethnography and docufiction. But I'm still like, because I'm doing my PhD, I've been asked to really scrutinise my practice. And the more you scrutinise your practice, the more you're like, oh my God, I think I could be this and this and this. So I have to say I'm at this kind of like shape-shifting, skin-shedding, like reassessing everything. But I can definitely say that my art practice is grounded in participatory practice and art as social practice. Mm-hmm. And I straddle the worlds of being a sort of conventional campaigner and then more of like a thinking through reflective artworks, which for the past few years have predominantly been documentary and sound-based. But I'm getting really, really interested in embodiment. So that's the link.
Let's have a look at these slides then of the actual interiors of the houses. If you could both talk us through.
You do it. You talk. You talk.
Yes. Lord, you talk. Yeah, let's start through the beginning and walk through.
Yeah, so this is, the doors close when you arrive, and that's when you hear the friendly estate agent, and then and the door opens and you kind of ushered inside.
When you hear a friendly estate agent, you would walk in expecting to hear some nice, gentle, kind music as you browsed, like as if you were walking around a furniture showroom.
It's a fairly stark contrast, and then the door closes behind, and it's very dark.
What have you got in your hands at that stage?
Well, yeah. So this is you've got your 3 keys. You've got your property viewing with the schedule saying which order they should be in. So the 3 people who are entering have got 3 different orders, and the oppressive music is playing. So that's slide 1. And this door isn't open, the red door in front of you, and you can't. And it's locked, and you can't get in. So that's a bit of a mystery at this stage. If you were to try it.
Yeah, and you're hearing the estate agent, well, the music is very oppressive and it's very black, you know, it's very demanding environment. You're disoriented, you're confused, you're probably like, oh my God, trying to figure out where you're going. And the lovely estate agent directs you a bit, doesn't she? You're given occasional direction to move on to your property viewing.
And that's, in terms of process, actually, that took a while to establish how long that was going to take.
Yeah.
I think all of these, there are 3 corridor pieces. We actually heard the second one, and as I say, a much earlier version of it. But initially, I think they were 7-minute pieces, which eventually got down to, I think, 45 seconds or 42 seconds.
Yeah. So in our first narrative structure, we were like, okay, there's 3 chapters whereby you make the transition from each property viewing to pass through your next, and each transition you hit the corridor of oppression, you hit the free market economy and current political thought and analysis. And yeah, the original sections in our first edits, each corridor was 7 minutes of listening, and we were like, all right, people are probably not going to stand in a pitch black corridor with a key.
Yeah, depressed. just waiting to be told what to do next.
Being bombarded with stories of.
I think you would have liked that, though.
I would have really liked
Ideally,
that, but
if we could have found a way to keep everyone in the dark for 7 minutes listening to. Yeah, stories of market disciplinary measures.
You come out into the corridor from each room and stand there and listen to 7 hours of discourse and music.
Yeah, so we did make it a bit shorter in terms of experiential usability and flow.
And that's actually the point where we used work by Matthias Kispert, who is one of the people who came through the call out through Sound and Music, and he gave us some wonderful. He totally understood straight away the nature of the collaboration and gave us a kind of a 2.5-minute piece that stood alone, but he also gave us all the stems, and it was a soundscape work using which was through Max MSP, but using sounds of construction and keys and doors slamming and little elements of vocal. Kind of,
Boris Johnson was in there.
Boris Johnson was in there, yeah.
Real estate property developers from London housing, kind of high-end sales events were in there, kind of saying, London is prime real estate development opportunity, and so he had sampled a lot of the optimum take on the London housing market. So if you're rich enough to buy in as property as a capital asset instead of property as a home, then you're laughing. So he'd gone with that kind of fairly dystopian in its own right commentary. But his jangling keys and door slamming as a first response was amazing, because the door was a really important part of the piece, symbolically and practically. So that was really exciting to get this guy's submission and be like, wow.
Should we move on to the next one? Let's actually look inside the properties.
Yeah.
Through the keyhole.
So this would be...
it's a small room.
This is the room that we listened to the audio from this room earlier. So this is the kind of symbolic of a council house tenant, property owner, and yes, I had nothing to do with this part, but it was a really interesting experience for me to have spent literally hours editing down these interviews and coming up with some music. But I had this interesting experience when we were setting it up of going in and sitting down in the chair and listening to the audio, and it was entirely different. And I really felt that what the architecture of the work and the set added, because I'd had so much time with just the audio. It was really clear what that brought in terms of like a physical experience.
Yeah.
And it felt like I listened to it again for the first time, and I really enjoyed it. So
cool.
So you've got headphones on the wall. You pick up the headphones and you sit on the sofa and you hear the interview. And at the end, friendly estate agent comes back in and says, "Time to move on to your next property."
She's not that friendly though, is she?
She kind of gets a little bit
She's
more...
a bit friendly, but she's also menacing. So she's not friendly. You don't think she's friendly? I don't think
quite
she's
be
friendly. She gets quite passive aggressive in the subtext.
Let's have a look at the next room then.
So that is number 14, and so what we're doing here through the set is that we're broadly alluding to class stereotypes, in case you haven't guessed. So this is our Walthamstow middle class Victorian terrace that is a guide price on the market at £420,000. So we've got to remember, as you're walking through, you're still subscribing to a property viewing. You're mimicking going around at a weekend looking for the home that you want to buy, irrespective of if you can or can't afford it. Because at this point, maybe the person going through the experience has appropriated a different character. Maybe they're like, yeah, I got loads of money, even if they don't. Or maybe someone's thinking about like, oh, God, I don't think I'd be able to afford any of these, even as an average salary earner, for example. So I think the way the audience are responding to this is going to be very interesting, because there's lots of different ways you could make sense of the experience. But this is number 14, Fern for You, and it's where you hear another story about home from a middle-class perspective. And as I say this, I really would love to hear some questions at the end, because when we talk about class, like, what are we talking about? Because you have to take some very brave stereotypes to get there, but there's a lot of nuance in between, so I need to
I also think that that's not actually made explicit in the work. It's there if there's clearly a difference in value in these properties, but it was a question that Caitlin asked in the interviews initially, was what class do you identify as? And it was interesting to hear people's answers. And in the initial cuts, we had that, and something just felt so. It was almost like the most intimate question of all of them, and maybe something felt that too much was being spelt out, or that it would diminish the kind of the ability for the participant to come in and have their own experience of what that person's life was like and how they might see themselves. Well,
there's something more intimate about what class a person perceives themselves as, rather than what sort of like hard socio-economic statistics would suggest what class that person belongs to. What the person perceives themselves as says a lot more.
But I think as well, at that point, I think think we had an interesting conversation where I kind of felt that the adherence to this, broadly speaking, free band of kind of class structure that's the commonplace terminology that we use. Actually, I'm not sure how much that fits the reality of the situation anymore for a lot of people, or how useful it is to consistently be labelling ourselves and labelling others within those bands, because there are I think also other people's, and it'd be interesting to hear questions and have conversation about this. I think it's part of the point of the piece is to have these kind of conversations, but actually how much of class is to do with socio-economic what we call purely economic conditions, and how much is actually to do with value and education. Obviously access to education is one thing, but value, the values that people hold can be wildly different compared to what their economic reality is, and that's more, I think, more so than ever at this point in time.
And I just want to chip in there and say something about, because there's a narrative choice to choose the 3 conventional class tier system, working, middle, upper, in this piece, because I was referring to kind of clearer and broader thinking around class. But in 2011 there was a new study that identified 7 clear class stratas in the UK. So already there's, we have to modernise and acknowledge that it's way more complicated. And out of that new system, for example, was born the precariat, which is a really big kind of term that's thrown around when we think about the millennials, and in terms of the relationship between a value-based identity around class, which is, to do with cultural capital and kind of an ability to manoeuvre through theoretical and sort of scholarly terms to demonstrate your learnedness and education and migration and all the rest of it.
Yeah, understanding of social convention.
Yeah, and to kind of be able to straddle social identities and norms. I just want to bring in that the national, I can't remember what they're called, I think they're the National Federation of Statistics, or the National Office of Statistics, last year identified that the national average salary, if we want to talk about class, we've got to talk about money, and the national average salary was 26.5 grand. So if you're looking at what you can afford, if you haven't got inheritance, in terms of current property averages, you're 8 times out of the reach of an average house price in the UK at roughly £200,000. We're not talking about London, we're talking about the national average. So, of course, I won't say, we're definitely talking about values and aspiration and migration, but why I would make a piece about property and you're choosing about what you can afford on the bidding card is we're thinking about how class actually translates to what financial manoeuvrability you have in your possession, whether it's through inheritance or your earnings or your savings, and they're all actually quite concrete. But I wouldn't go as far to say that they are the essence of class identity, but I think breaking through this taboo is quite important if we're starting to think about access to a degree of distribution of resources. So that's my little economic rant.
Well, so presumably the third one, as you've said, it's built around the classic structure. So the third room is going to be the upper class room.
Would you like to have a look at our upper class property? It's number 1 Appleton Crescent. It's a Georgian townhouse. So yeah, go. I mean, you can probably guess what happens in there now from the formula of before. But you
There's
pick
the
up the
headphones.
headset. Yeah. Yeah.
The obvious thing to say about these 3 houses is they've also grown in size as
yeah.
they've gone along.
And I mean, I need to give full kudos to Tabitha, because when we were planning the installation, how do we talk about class and the stereotypes of class through housing spatially? I was like, let's have 3 box rooms and we'll have different wallpaper. And she was like, oh no, coving, architrave. I know new terms about decor and interior design that I didn't know about. Coving counts if you're looking at the semiotics of class identity. Coving is the skirting board you see on the ceiling. It's got loads of ridges and details, and in the council house it's just plain. So these were the level of detail that Tabby went to in thinking through how we're going to spatially signify through material signification, space, height of ceiling. Actually, all the ceilings are the same height. We did want high ceilings, but we couldn't afford it in the budget. And I think, yeah, just the detailing of each room, from the sort of the doors to the locks to the numbers to the interior. And there's a lot more we could have done, but it really came down to like any realisation of, fabricating an idea, it came down to the budget and the time and the labour.
And somebody did comment on the, was it architrave?
Architrave,
Somebody commented on it, the first person that went through actually came out and said, where did you get that? That was a really nice touch. So it was all worthwhile.
Yeah.
Not quite what you expected, though. So let's talk about how this relates to how this installation is commenting on the sort of housing situation here in the UK, I guess, for a bit. So we're particularly, in this country, and I guess America's the same, compared to Europe, obsessed with home ownership rather than renting. Many more people rent properties in Europe, and that's the norm. James Wood, who's not here, this forms part of his research as well, so I wanted to talk about that. He studies particularly the difference between the UK and Denmark, was it? So what's the situation in Denmark? How much of that can you tell us about?
I'm not going to be able to do justice
to
his
but
research.
Give us a brief overview of James's work.
So my understanding is that in the UK, owner occupancy is the dominant aspiration, and that means that we are encouraged to aspire to come into possession of our own house through individual or partner-based ownership. And that's incentivised through mortgage finance, and it's also incentivised through the much more subtle spaces of kind of norms and values and social conventions. And in Denmark and Copenhagen, that isn't the case. There's not such a dominant aspiration to own your own home. And there's similar links broadly to glance to in Germany. And we need to ask what is at play that lessens this dominant aspiration, that makes it much more tolerable to be a long-term tenant in the rental market, or that makes it much more feasible. So in terms of, I'm not going to do his research justice, but I'm going to articulate my own understanding, is that there's higher regulation of the rental market. So when we look at housing, we have the rental market and we have the buyer's market. And they're really, really interconnected, because obviously if you can't afford to buy, then you're going to rent. And if the rental market isn't either regulated through capping market rents or offering capped long-term rental rates for long-term tenancy, so a 10-year tenancy at a fixed rate, for example, people who are forced into the rental market have very, very little agency over kind of how they're going to save money and what money they've got left at the end of the month, for example. So I know that there's better regulation in terms of the rental market, but there's less, it's got to do with things like the protection of the welfare state and having a safety blanket. So for example, we could say, if we're going to talk about the welfare state in UK housing, we should talk about the protection of social housing, local authority, affordable housing that's rented out at less than the market rate. And I have a really good fact here that I need to read because I need to get it right. So since the right to buy was introduced by Thatcher in the 80s, where social council housing stock was sold off at a really cheap rate, the stock has been rapidly falling, and since the 80s it was at 31% of the total UK available housing was social housing, and now it's 17%. So if I want to talk about welfare, I want to talk about, is there a ring fencing of affordable housing if the rental market isn't regulated? So I think, when we think about Denmark, it's got things to do with a political incentive to make sure that the rental market is managed by more than just the market, the best price you can get for rental. But I'm not going to attempt to go into the in-depth analysis of James's research, because that's his specialism.
This is my understanding of the situation in Germany is from the perspective of somebody renting, is that it's totally understood socially that would be that you would do that long term. You would expect to have a decent relationship with your landlord, and and the tenancies are much longer. You
Yeah.
have far more latitude as to what you can do with the property. You can really make it your own. And actually, anecdotally, I've heard that the way that the Germans will view the British attitude to the property market is there's an obsession with owning. Why would you want to own your property? You don't need to. Surely you could just rent and make it really nice and have your family and feel secure. But that's not our experience in the UK when it comes to property. And I think if anything, looping back to the way that's embodied in the work is that it's kind of intensified through the experience. I think all of those edges and I think that's kind of the approach that Kaplan took. Whether she was aware of it or not, that it's on going through the experience. That's how you feel that on the other end. Wow, this is what happens, but it's happened in a really short space of time, really loudly and really intensely. So I guess hopefully it starts some conversation.
Yeah, and one other last point to make, just linking in James's research, because obviously it relates to the first conception of the commission and then the end materiality of the piece. Another broad area, a specific area of inquiry for his research is looking at how mortgage finance, so when you choose to take on a mortgage to own your own home, which again is about the have and the have-nots. So if you don't have inheritance or family wealth, you're going to save your deposit and get a mortgage, and you'll pay it off for 28 to 35 years with interest. And he looks at how the financialisation of the individual regulates our choices and our behaviours. So we will be less free, we will be less spontaneous, we will prioritise a promotion, a salaried job over an intellectual inquiry, over some autonomous thinking. We will go to work and we will work hard and we will not jeopardise that because we are due to pay back our financialised individual self for the next 38 years or whatever it is. So I think we need to think about, when we think about owner occupancy as like a national obsession, it's not just that, oh great, I'm on the property market, I'm going to have a return when I sell it in my retirement and give some money to my children. You have also subscribed to a behavioural limitation of forcing yourself into a really, really dominant labour market. And that is not, surely we have to think, is that worth owning the home? Mm-hmm. Is that lifelong wage slavery, whatever your profession, worth home ownership? And is there another way to have housing security and not be so disciplined by the labour market? So that's his research, and that's an important question to think about.
And I think I would add there that it's not just that subscribing to the labour market, but it's subscribing to a particular version, like the dominant version of free market corporate capitalism, with the kind of the dominant kind of political ideology which holds that in place, being a neoliberal view that somehow the market will make everything work, and all we need to do is buy more and
work harder
and
work harder
and make the most of our capital. And I, just to add, and I'm sure that this is touched. This is part of James's research. It must be, because I think I've heard it from you, but this is now third hand. But I think it's part of a huge part of the criticism that is implicit in the work is of the way that housing is now dominantly viewed by our culture as an entirely acceptable mode of capital, of holding capital assets. And I think these kind of ideas are around for everyone, and they've definitely been around for me, but certainly working on the project, it's just come home to me in such a huge way of how insane that is, because housing, and that's this whole idea in the piece that you actually you go to a property viewing, but actually what you're faced with is somebody's subjective experience and their intimate reality and their experience of home, because in the past, gold and silver and herbs and spices and cattle were, and maybe land were capital assets, but now it's the biggest, it's the largest source of capital, of held capital by the majority of the population is in housing, and that's and housing isn't just housing. Housing are people's homes and people's access to homes.
But that's especially highlighted when there's huge swathes of London that are owned by plutocrats from elsewhere that don't have people living in them. So there's just like whole streets that are empty because those houses are the assets. They're definitely not anybody's homes. I mean, it is one thing to say, to the person that owns their own home, that's an investment that they've made, but to own like streets to streets of houses just seems insane.
That you're not making available.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When there's a housing crisis.
I think that distinction really needs to be clearly set. That I'll speak for myself personally, because this is obviously all of a conceptual inquiry through the work. I don't think there's anything wrong with aspiring to come into possession of your home, to buy your house, to live in for the long run. I think we have to look at the distinction between multi-property, buy-to-let landlords, and the concentration of that power when property as a capital asset is really, really capitalised on. And the translation of that is that they're probably going to be buying them to rent them out or to see the investment increase. And what that does is it forces people that haven't got a hope in hell of getting a deposit and an investment in their first property into really long-term and affordable rental markets, and that's deeply unfair. So I just want to make that distinction. I don't think wanting to own your own home is a bad thing. And this is, this is to do, we're getting into the territory of the concept behind the work, and I'm also quite keen to keep it like jumping between the space and the narrative, these ideas, because the reason we made this piece, right, is so that when audiences go through, you're invited to reflect on what you aspire to and what sort of property you might buy, and to link it back a bit experientially is at the end there's a narrative chapter. The closing chapter is an auction room where the narrative resolve is you're forced into, have we got a picture of the auction room? Woo. So you in terms of like the function of how the experience is set, is you're invited to bid on one of the 3 properties or not.
So we're through that door now.
So the red door is locked while you've been looking at your properties, and people might, I really want to put a GoPro camera in the ceiling and film like those people, but it's totally unethical and we can't, but like that would be my ideal, is to see how many people try to like open that red door at the beginning, because I definitely would try to open I'm at the red door. Why aren't I allowed in the red door? So at the end, the red door is unlocked. So there's a difference. This mysterious door is open and you enter into it, and the audio and the music and the very not friendly estate agent invites you to bid on which room you would like to invest in. So I feel like, we want to talk about housing economics and social justice and economic identity and class, but in this moment in the experience, the closing part of your journey is where you're invited to bid on the bidding sheet and determine your own reality. And obviously it's an imagined space. You're not going to go with the keys to like number 1 Appleton Crescent, but you're kind of invited to think through what you might like to do given the chance in the market. And I think that's an important purpose when you think about it relates back to the question, what social function and kind of political invitations can art and creative experiences make? Because I'm really happy to talk about the theory, but I want to link it back to the materiality and the experience and the ideas in that narrative structure, because that's how we've chosen to think it through, isn't it?
One of Catherine's catchphrases that I've picked up is that, which is that we enact our politics through our financial choices. And that's, I think, what this is symbolising, or inviting people to kind of scrutinise within themselves.
Well, we've got about only 5 minutes left, so I don't want to finish without us going back to the music a little bit, and I just want to ask Luke about. So you consider yourself to be a political musician. Political music is not something that's popular commercially.
No, I would say I consider myself to be. I certainly was had a long period of time of being very active in various ways that had nothing to do with music, and in political sphere, I suppose, activism and so on, and always was wondering how these 2 things were going to find their way together in my life, and at some point I think I had the idea that it would be a kind of stealth approach, that I would be writing music that somehow it would be embodied it would be embodied in there if you wanted to look for it, and otherwise you'd kind of take it in by osmosis, or just the fact that the music wasn't subscribing to the dominant norms of whatever it is that people think is going to sell when it comes to content, especially with lyrics and videos and so on. So I think I had a rather rosy idea that would somehow break through into the marketplace, and everyone would find themselves desperately wanting to buy this secretly subversive yet entirely enjoyable, work. And I, on a creative level, I'm very pleased with what I achieved in that respect, and it didn't necessarily pan out exactly as I had it in mind. And as you say, I came up against a marketplace which is, as far as music is concerned, more competitive than ever, with less and less investment and support for development. And although there are so many opportunities to release and have your music heard and to have access to the means of creating music, which I think is wonderful, there's also far more of a focus on exactly what it is, the magical thing that's going to sell at this point in time, and that appears to be more a personality and a brand and some kind of lifestyle, and a lot less to do with the content of the music or its kind of relative merits. I'm sure in some ways that's always been the case, but it certainly appears to be heightened now in terms of what receives investment and what is made available to the public on a large scale. There was a period in music, and I think in recent music history that everyone knows about, where Napster and SoulSeek and these file sharing platforms blew the music world wide open, and suddenly everyone had access to everything. And this was greeted as being quite a wonderful kind of democratization of supply and demand. And certain people found ways to make that work with their career in a way that existed completely outside of the previous kind of dominant record label-led marketplace. But gradually, I think over the last 10 years, that has been clawed back by the big labels, the big three that there are now, in terms of their relationships with Google, YouTube, Spotify. It's not as democratic as all that. So I think for me, having its involvement in this piece has been really interesting, because it's like I'm getting to engage with all these ideas and put the music out in a way that and collaborate in a way which isn't welcomed in that market-led side of the industry. And I think specifically, I'd say it's there's a sense that it's if you want to address these areas from the perspective of just being a musician, you just do it and you put it out there, and you definitely won't. There's not an obvious demand, and there's not an obvious set of support structures, which exists far more for artistic ideas that broach these topics.
Well, we're pretty much out of time, and this is normally the point where we would go to audience questions, but Caitlin, you were going to ask the audience a question, so why don't you finish off with that?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that. I would have been sad to see that one slip. So yeah, I just have a question for the audience. Given the option in your day-to-day life, not ideologically, just in your day-to-day life, would you rather currently rent your home or buy your home? So I guess I could do a show of hands. So if you'd rather, like right now where you are at in your life currently, what would you rather do? So if you'd rather rent, you can put your hands up, and if you'd rather buy, you can keep your hands down.
The specific home that you're living in now?
No, to do with your current status, to do with where you're at in your life now. Given the chance, what would you rather? That's my question to the audience. So this is for renting. Hands up for renting. Oh, yeah, me too.
Well, based on or for me or for like society, and so I just can't even comprehend it in relation to my day-to-day life.
Yeah.
My what's financial situation or all the other things. Because it was my day-to-day life. In a way, that's not going to change. I can't almost grasp it within that frame.
When I say day-to-day, I mean kind of thinking about, you know, like your what you're earning, like your values. Yeah, could you, and also, because there are different questions there, like pragmatically, economically, could you, but ideologically, would you? You know, because they're different, they're different. But I just wanted to hear, like, why, actually, if we've got just a couple of, like, retorts from the floor, like, why, because most of you put your hand up to rent there. So, like, yeah.
I guess in my life at the moment, the idea of, although I'm a Londoner and I love London, the idea of being tied to it in that kind of financial, I don't know, like races almost, sounds horrific. I'm not really ready. Well, I don't know if I'll be ever settled in it in that way. It is really hard to imagine because comprehending being able to afford to buy a house I would want to live in. I can't.
Yeah,
right now.
yeah,
I can't
yeah.
imagine that. So, but yeah, right now in my life it wouldn't suit me at all.
It's a kind of long-termism of it as well as the what's on the market within, you know, within range.
But it's more, about my lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah. And then?
Oh, yeah, just, I've been having some quite hard sort of home building pans recently, kind of for the first time. But I totally kind of threw it out the window that would be in London. I think that's a lot because of the housing crisis. So when you ask, would you
prefer?
I don't know if it's possible. Maybe I'll think differently, but yeah.
So it's interesting because there's a pragmaticism that precedes the ideal. You know, like people go, well, I just don't know if it's, I just don't think I could, which is in a thought process really. It's very inhibitive to have a practical reality inhibit our ideal.
Maybe
you know,
you could, with sacrifices involved and what would be affordable and what would stretch you to. I'm making it work.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is why I say,
Yeah. Do you think Londoners need to buy up whole streets? Sorry, there's a gentleman. yeah, we came across that maxim quite a bit in the interviews.
So would you be on the side of wanting to buy and own? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it raises really interesting questions about the psychology of security as well. You know, it's not just like, oh great, now I am financially secure. It's also where do we, through this project and the interviews, it wasn't just economics, it's what is the psychology of home. And I just want to say a really beautiful theme that emerged through the interviews that warmed my heart was people talking about being comfortable. And when you really think about what physical comfort is, and you know, people would be like, I'd ask them to describe the physicality of comfort, and a lot of people would sigh. They'd go, and you're like, comfort, that old friend, where are you? Like, how long do we have to be in leisure and comfort? And you know, then we have to say, is comfort an experience of affordability now?
And is your home somewhere where comfort is even possible, or is your home somewhere where you head back to and fall asleep watching something on Netflix and then head straight out to work again the next day?
But I think I would also always protect the tenets of comfort and sanctuary and rehabilitation and nourishment, like soft words, but words that really play out through the fabric of the home. And I think we shouldn't just think about just affordability. It's really interesting. I hope it comes through some of the interviews because I asked a lot of questions around a sensation of home and a sensation of well-being and what that meant. And I think that's equally as important when we think about who gets to afford what, but what is the cultural construct of home anyway? Because then you could argue against it with nomadic cultures. So it's interesting to think about that.
And I think that's a point where we'll have to bring it to a close because we've gone way over our hour. And if you haven't seen Discord yet, it closes on the 2nd of October, so you've still got a few weeks, and you've well, barely experienced it today, so go and have the full immersive experience. We've been live streaming tonight via This Is Tomorrow, and if you want to see this again, or if you want to recommend to anybody else to watch it, in a couple of days you can find the video on the King's website, which is www.kcl.ac.uk/Utopia 2016. And we're back next week on the 15th for Utopia Lab, not with myself, but with my Little Atoms colleague, Caroline Christie, because I'm going to be on holiday. So before I rush off to go on holiday, if you would just give your appreciation for Caitlin Shepherd and Luke Harney. Thank you very much for coming.